ghost still awaits you. Go on alone. Follow your dream, though it lead to worlds unknown. Life's but a shadow, once our dreams have flown. What if men cry, your dream is not our own? Your soul knows the answer. Go on alone. Give life your heart, bless everything that's grown. Fear not the loving, all this world's your own. Make rich the soil, but once the seed is sown, seek freedom, don't linger. Go on alone. Walk like a man, even though you walk alone. Why court approval once the road is known? Let come who will, but if they all turn home, the ghost still awaits you. Go on alone. Go on alone. Go on alone.
Well, this month we are celebrating the life of Swamiji, and we thought to dedicate each satsang to some aspect of his life. We're doing so because this month is the month of his Samadhi Day or Moksha Day, which is this Tuesday, the 21st of April. And in fact, we will be having our long meditation on that day, Tuesday, the day of his Samadhi. We'll also have we'll have some kind of a ceremony, some kind of a something going on in addition. It won't just be a straight 4-hour meditation, but it will be from 6 to 10, and it will be mostly meditation. And this will be in place of our normal Thursday meditation. And as you know, last week we went through Swamiji's music. Dharmini led us through an experiential of this whole aspect of his work, which again is something to keep in mind, that when he wrote this music, he wrote his first music right shortly after being separated from SRF. And one of the things, YSS SRF, one of the things that he thought in doing so, in addition to his inspiration for it, was he was eager not to be in competition with them. So if he was sharing publicly in the interest of harmony and cooperation and even a sense of maybe obedience isn't quite the right word, because he certainly felt obedient to Master as his guru, but still, even in that sense, he wanted to be clear, I don't want to compete. And I say that so that you can keep in mind how careful Swamiji was, how much he thought everything through, and how that spirit of his continues even today. And so he was very much not only concerned but sensitive and aware that we should be strong in ourselves as disciples of Master, but never in a spirit of competition, and never in a spirit of comparison and so on, and also being considerate in that way. And so each one of us takes that up in our own way. This is regarding not just YSS, but any path. Sometimes people will come to you and say something that's directly opposite to Master's teachings. And it may be, although, as one saint had said to Swami, if the disciples really understood their gurus, there would be no fighting amongst anyone, because everybody's speaking from that same truth, but lending different emphasis according to the needs of the time that they're in, and also according to the needs of the specific disciples, and according to their own unique ray of the divine that they are bringing. And so I'll leave it at that. But what we wanted to share today was that aspect of Swami's missions that includes his writing. And so I wanted to begin by reading to you. This is from a book called The Story Behind the Story, which is unfortunately out of print now, and I don't know if and when it will come back in print. It's a small book that someone asked Swamiji, why don't you write about all of your books, write a book about your books, so we can sort of know historically all the things that went on and so on. And this is such a major part of his work. And it was such a dynamic part at the time when each year he would write anywhere from 1 to 5 books and so on usually. And just amazing, his creative output. But to understand what was behind that, what we can draw from it for ourselves in our own lives. And it's also important to understand his motivation for writing. Swamiji says, "When my guru told me that my task would be, among other things, to write books, I replied, 'Sir, haven't you already expressed everything necessary through your own writings?' He seemed surprised at my short-sightedness. 'Don't say that,' he exclaimed. 'Much more is needed.' I realized in time that his teachings, like seeds, are destined to grow and spread out, eventually to become like a vast forest. I saw his teachings also as the hub of a great wheel from which central truths radiate outward in all directions like spokes on a bicycle wheel. My guru himself showed in some of his writings how those spokes might reach out into every aspect of life, providing fresh and meaningful insights. In effect, the hub that formed the center of his teachings had the potential to energize humanity's entire existence. I set out to write books, therefore, that would demonstrate how life lived at every level could be given deeper meaning, how one could succeed at anything he wanted and attain any goal he set for himself. Above all, the simple rules of life he gave to the world can help everyone to achieve the universal goal of life, happiness. I've written because my guru charged me to. Would I have written otherwise? I'm not so sure. Though my ambition as a young man was to be a poet and playwright, when the realization dawned on me at 21 that I didn't myself know the truths I'd been hoping to share with others, I determined to give up writing altogether, unless and until I could know those truths for myself. I also understood that my guru had given me this charge because he saw that this was what I needed for my own spiritual growth. For it was his way to help each of us to develop along our own natural bent. Writing came naturally to me, so it was also natural that he should encourage me to use this tendency for my own spiritual development. More was involved in my guru's instructions, of course, than developing our own natural talents. He had a mission to spread. It was our own good karma if we could help him in that Herculean task. Apart from any ability I had with words, there was also the fact that I had an intense desire not only to find truth, but also to help others to find it. Writing for me meant learning to express truth as joy and inspiration. After I came to him, my aspiration changed to a lifelong resolution to reach out to others with his teachings. I should add also that my own work has been simply to water the seeds that were planted by my guru. Always it has been my hope to inspire others, whether few or many, to explore deeply the ramifications of his teachings. What he said to me remains forever true. Much more is needed. I have tried humbly to do my bit in getting the ball rolling. In so doing, I have, of necessity, been only relatively successful. Still, in terms of normal worldly reckoning, my books have had some success. Taken all together, they've so far sold about 3 million copies in English alone, and have been published in 27 languages. This contribution has been small compared to humanity's need everywhere. Even so, the effort has been worthwhile, to me intensely so. Most important of all, perhaps, it has inspired others also to act. No matter how much anyone or any group of people accomplish, I think what my Guru said to me will remain true for centuries to come. Much more is needed. And that's a very important point Swamiji emphasized. For him, writing meant expressing truths with creativity and inspiration and with joy. In other words, it's not enough to just simply state what you have to say. He said many authors don't even edit their work, just being content with the sheer effort of blurting out their thoughts onto paper and calling it good. And he would edit and edit and edit and edit his books so many times. And the more in his later years, sometimes he would edit them even more, meaning it would take him longer. And you would think, well, but maybe he's good at editing now, he can just write it right the first time and so on. But it wasn't that. He was tuning into the subtlety, to the vibration, to the feeling. He worked on rhythm, on the tone color of words, which is something that we think of in terms of music and also in poetry. And so I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but it's like you choose certain words like a poet does because of the subtle feeling behind them, which isn't necessarily with meaning, but also because of the rhythm. It's so easy to write sentences that if all you had, the simple thing you could do whenever you write anything is just read it aloud and see how it sounds. And so often it can just sound just like, da 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 da. I mean, just no energy in it at all. And so varying long sentences, short certain sentences, but he would rearrange words. One hint he gave us in his editing process was that, very often people will leave the last word of a sentence even when reading it, and they'll say it with their voice dropping down. It was such an important thing that he said. And I was so happy to be there for it. And people will do that all the time. And so for your reading, keep that in mind. He said the last word is the word you should emphasize in reading, especially if it's written well, because the last word is the thought, or the word that we're left with. And so we should say, I was so happy to see him. So then we realize, okay, we're emphasizing this because I had been missing him for so long and finally he came. You emphasize that even in a useless sentence, you emphasize that word and we sort of get a little more of what you're talking about. But in writing, he said, especially, make sure that poignant part of the sentence is at the end. The beginning is also important. That's why it's a little bit frustrating if you're an English speaker in other languages, like when you're learning German, and actually Hindi does this too, and I don't know, Tamil may, but in complex sentences you can even say, the gentle boy, the verb comes at the end. So, the gentle boy, the bright red ball, kicked. Okay, finally, now I know what happened. I've just got this boy going like this, I've got this ball. What's happening? In English we would say, the gentle boy kicked, and we don't go, oh, what did he kick? A ball. Okay, thank God. It's not like that. You're just sort of, it goes. This gentle boy, the guy who was there, okay, what's he doing? Fine, I got it. But so when you've got this word at the end, and again, you're kind of stuck by the grammatical structure. You have to put the verb at the end. And so I'm sure that's a natural way of thinking. And that's one reason why it's good to learn different languages, because you understand. And most of you know, well, all of you, know Tamil and English. And so you're used to a flow of stating your words in different ways. That's why it's fun for us sometimes to learn. For example, when I learned Hindi, I suddenly understood why Hindi speakers would speak English in the words in a different order, because it was matching the Hindi grammatical structure. And, all kinds of things. Yes, I am knowing. Now, yes, I know. Yes, I am knowing. And because that's what you say in Hindi. That's how you say, I know, I am knowing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a perfect, but abdiya, okay. Now I understand. And so it's very helpful to break out of that structure, because we learn in our mother tongue, this is the way to speak. This is the way to think. It's not at all the way to think. But it's one way to think. And it's good mentally to do that. But he said for that reason also, English, he said, I think he said it's the most beautiful language. Because he said it has so many more words than any other language. I think 3 times more than, I think he even said all the Romance languages combined. English has even more than that. And it's very flexible. It admits of new words very easily. You don't have to assign them a gender. I mean, just imagine, okay, like in Hindi, something is male or female and so on. So you have to say, okay, iPad, male or female? Obviously female. What? Why not male? Well, okay. And I mean, in German you have 3 genders, male, female, and neuter. And it's just, it gets on and on. So not only that, but then once you've committed to a sentence, especially when speaking, in, for example, French, you're forced to finish it in a certain way because of the grammatical structure that you've chosen. And so you can't even in inspiration sort of change where you're going with it, because the subject and the end, the beginning and the end have to agree grammatically. So you're stuck in that way. And again, it's nothing against French, but it's just saying the spontaneity of English, how you can shift gears. And also in writing, you can move verbs, you can move everything all around. You can't say the gentle boy the red ball kicked, but you can still do all kinds of things that way. And so you can make it match the rhythm and the creative inspiration that you're trying to flow through it. Whereas many of us don't even think about the order in which we say things or the order in which we write things. Again, I'm just glad I said anything at all. And so who cares, what this and what that. But Swamiji showed us by his concentration on editing how important it is. And then he said it would be a little bit gratifying and frustrating when someone would just say, oh yeah, it reads so easily. It's so obvious. And he said, yes, but I worked weeks on making it appear obvious, and people would sometimes just read, because it's almost in a way it just goes right in. It's just like you open up and the book just goes right in, right into the ear, right into the eyes, right into the heart. But he worked very deliberately and conscientiously on that. And so I wanted to share with you the story of some of his books, because it's important for 2 reasons, I was thinking. One is to understand the books themselves, but also to understand the progression of how they evolved, how they came out. Swamiji makes the point that his thinking did not evolve in the sense of him re-examining fundamental truths, of him changing his mind. He said, there isn't a word that I can think of or a sentence that I've written that I view with regret and wish I could take back, and so on. Some of his books he did later edit in his last years. The New Path, for example, was originally The Path, and so on. And so there were some things that he did take the time to re-examine. But again, it was just offering new insight, new stories in the case of that book, and so on, and just enhancing it. But it wasn't, oh gosh, I said this all wrong and now I really have to say it right, which you could imagine would be natural. And for probably most of us, we would feel, this. And so, so it wasn't that he was exploring intellectual vistas that he was learning as he was writing about fundamental truths. Those he felt, of course, from Master. But in terms of new ways of expressing them and relating to new facts, new aspects of reality, every book was new and stood on its own. In fact, one famous author said to him, I'm writing a new book. And then she said in a moment of candor, well, they're all the same, really. And in fact, that's very true of many authors. Their first book, or their first big book, is a big hit, and then the public demands, okay, give us more. Chicken soup for the soul, chicken soup for the artist's soul, chicken soup. They've probably come up with some new, there's some terminology for that for our vegetarian communities. Rasam for the soul, payasam for the soul, sambar for the soul. But basically, chicken soup is that cultural thing that is the thing that mother gives you when you're sick and it always heals. And so it's nourishing stories and advice to open the heart. This was very popular in the 90s and so on. So chicken soup for the artist's soul, chicken soup for the mother's soul, finally chicken soup for the chicken soul. Right? It's just like, yeah, lay off the chicken soup, okay? Let me walk around in peace, the chicken was saying. So this kind of thing, there's just a demand, and it's hard to also continue to take creative risks. Because they say, this is what we want the same, we want that brand. And in a way, sometimes an artist or an author can get trapped into, this is what we expect of you, and if you deviate from that, we'll shine the limelight on someone else. And so he said, from the beginning, I wanted to self-publish, so I had control over my own works. I didn't want someone else editing them. I also didn't want someone else accepting or denying them as, no, this isn't for the today's crowd, and so on. And so, in any case, let's get into the books here. We'll start here. He said, this deserves to be my first book, which is originally called Crises in Modern Thought, now called Out of the Labyrinth. He said, for two reasons. One, it was the first book that I wrote after my separation from SRF, after he was separated from SRF. And the other reason it should be first is, he said, it was the first book I wrote in direct sort of awareness and consciousness of trying to fulfill my guru's statement to me that your work is lecturing and writing. And so he thought, this book would be a book that could help others. Because he had read in 1962, actually in India he was, an article written by the head of the philosophy department at MIT, saying that because of science's discoveries, we all know that life has no meaning. That thought and not even inspiration, but thought and all of our feelings are just byproducts of electrical impulses in our brain. And he said the man reported this as casually as one might report the morning news kind of thing. And that any right-thinking person could ask, has a man evolved any more in evolving a brain, than an elephant has in evolving a trunk? It's utterly meaningless. It's all relative, as Einstein tells us. So there's no absolute truth in anything. And so, of course, Swamiji felt this materialistic view, meaning that matter is what's real, was just completely wrong. Because he knew from what he'd learned from his guru that it's not true, and from his own experience. And yet, he also found it repulsive, as you might, just like, but he knew that he couldn't, he knew that so many people were believing this. In fact, he said, I wonder if the rise in suicide among teenagers isn't partly because they're fed this philosophy of meaninglessness. And so he said that I need to write an article to answer this, but I can't just say, this is stupid, or obviously there's God. Because you can't answer basically an atheistic philosophy by saying, yes, there is God. No, there isn't. There is too. I mean, that's no answer at all. And so he said, I had to answer them in terms of their own facts, in terms of their own logic, and show how, even in their own way, their philosophy was flawed. So, for example, he pointed out that Jean-Paul Sartre was one of the principal villains or saints of materialism, however you want to look at it, said in his whole development of philosophy, it was very complex, he says, man is radically free, is what he said. He can do whatever he wants. If he doesn't, he's not being true to himself. And so he makes ridiculous claims, like he wrote a play about a man who killed his mother and then declared before the whole town, see, I am a free man because I did what was in my heart and I wasn't held back by fear. Useless things, evil things even. And at the end of all of his philosophy argument, Jean-Paul Sartre says, therefore I have proved that man is radically free. And Swamiji said, you started with the premise that man is radically free, and then you said, therefore man is radically free. He said, it's circular logic. It's not true. You haven't proven anything. You can't begin with the premise and then prove it from the premise. You have to start with a hypothesis. And then, so he said he exposed him for the mental fraud that he was. But you see, he couldn't have just said, Sartre, blech. You have to show, he said, the untruth and the insincerity of it. Not even insincerity, just untruth is enough. We can conclude the rest. But he then showed how using these same facts you could reach one of two conclusions. Because matter is made of atoms, we are made of atoms, rocks are made of atoms, and atoms, they're all made of electrons and protons, they're all made of the same basic stuff. So, yet we appear to have consciousness. And so he said, so either we can make the conclusion that nothing is conscious, which is pretty stupid since it takes consciousness even to declare that nothing is conscious, or we can state that everything is conscious. And then he showed the experiments of Bose for showing, all the plants responding in all these different ways under high magnification. So he brought in new facts and just said, same facts, different conclusion. And so even when he brought this book to a professor who he had, I think he must have known him somehow because he was Romanian, there was some connection. He brought him some chapters on Darwin that he wanted this professor to read because he wanted to show that evolution was not completely accidental, but it showed a relativity, a progression towards something. That's the answer to relativity. We are in relation to something. It's not relative to nothing. And so directional relativity, here it is, I want to just talk about this one book for the whole talk, but I'll tell you why in a moment. Anyway, we're going towards something. And so, for example, that's what you see even in the evolution of consciousness epitomized by the caste system. Again, remember the caste system is not something hereditary, but something based on your own consciousness. So you, a child of a Brahmin, can be a Vaishya and vice versa. In fact, very often vice versa. Anyway, never mind. For Vaishya, it's good to say I can use my brain for a merchant consciousness, in other words, not merchants, because you can have a very saintly merchant or a very unsaintly merchant, but to say it's good for me to use my brain to get ahead in this world instead of not using my brain at all. But on the other hand, then you evolve to the level of understanding of a kshatriya, where you say, I want to use my brain to help other people, not simply just to always make sure I get a material gain out of it, and so on. That's a step forward. But until you're at that point, or if you're below that point, you don't say to someone, just meditate and be a saint. You say, take your next step. Everybody has to take their next step, and we see everybody struggling to take their next step. So we shouldn't sit, in fact, in judgment of anyone. In fact, Swamiji said when he rewrote this book, what he changed was the last chapter, which he said more or less at the time he had just dashed it off out the window, basically rejecting all of materialism. He said, I spent 10 years researching this book and in the camp of the enemy, so to speak. And it was just to have to do that, but he had to. But then at the end it was like, and therefore he could say what he really felt about it now that he'd established the shortcomings of it. He said when he rewrote the last chapter, he was able to even accept materialism as a necessary stepping stone on the path towards truth. At least people adopting a materialistic point of view are trying to relate their philosophy to objective reality, to results that have been measured and so on. They're trying to care about what is true. After all, results, experimentation, observation is one way of observing what is true. So it's, in their own way, it's a sincere attempt to move towards truth. And we have already moved through that, or are moving through that, or if we hadn't, we would find it intriguing and attractive now. So we were probably the best materialists of all. So it's not something to gloat over, but he saw, okay, even this makes sense. It's a way towards God. In fact, many atheists, many great devotees begin as atheists. So, you just never know. So again, it's not that he was judgmental in the first version, but he could expand that and include that when he had the time also to really do this. He said, this book is fundamental to everything I have taught. And even though it is not one of our biggest bestsellers, he said it's always remained at the center of everything I've tried to share of my guru's work and so on. And it forms a trilogy with 2 other books, which I'll hopefully try to mention as we get there. Okay, how am I going to do this? I guess I'll do it this way. The next one in time was The Art and Science of Raja Yoga. There were many books in between, but only for the sake of time, I'm only concentrating on a few. And I could almost hear Swamiji, why did you leave out that one? Just like, sorry, okay. So The Art and Science of Raja Yoga, every one of you is familiar with. And he wrote this book, he said, originally, again, as he thought it would be a one way to help earn income for Ananda, because it was struggling to support itself in the early years and so on. And so he thought through some lessons, he said, again, these were done through the mail, but eager not to compete with SRF's lessons, he concentrated on Hatha Yoga, which was not covered, or focused on in those lessons. And so the book principally consisted of Hatha Yoga and then had other things thrown in and so on. He wrote this at a very busy time of his life. He was teaching in the city, a different town, every week, every evening. Then he would go up to Ananda Village on Friday, which was again probably for him about a 2-hour drive. And then Friday night he would dictate one of the lessons in the Raja Yoga book. Then Saturday he would give classes for the retreat guests. He would give a concert, and then in the evening, then on Sunday he would give he would do a fire ceremony. And I mean, all of the original Sunday satsangs as we know them began really with the fire ceremony, and then Swamiji would give a talk afterwards. Then he would also have many interviews personally with people, private interviews, both on Saturday, a few on Sunday, and then he would drive back to the city, to one of the cities, to start the whole thing again. He said it was intense for him, very intense. So that's what this was born out of. And then many years later, he decided to rewrite the lessons as a full course in yoga philosophy, and not just emphasizing Hatha Yoga, but again to be sensitive to Master's lessons. He picked them all up from the point of view of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, or the Eightfold Path, which wasn't really treated, again, directly, and wasn't the intellectual organization of those lessons, the other lessons. And so that's really, this is really in a way a course on Ashtanga Yoga, which you might say, yes, of course, but again, understanding the context and the background of it. He later said the book should be published as a full book and so on, as opposed to just lessons that come. But even at the time that Dharmini came, when she got the lessons, I think she got them in the mail one at a time. And so when I came, it was a book, but in a spiral binding. They had taken the lessons and punched holes and put them in a binding, and now it's just a book. But it's got that same energy of learning directly from Swamiji. That's the greatest joy of all these things, because we've had a separation from him in physical space and in time. But when you read this, you're just sitting at his feet, having him speak to you. And he said that's often how he would write. He would picture his reader sitting opposite him as he was writing, and he would be sharing these things, and if the reader looked puzzled, then he would take a moment and clarify and so on. He said it was neither male nor female, but neither old nor young, but a friend, an interested friend. And this is how he would relate, and that's one of the reasons why I think we feel so touched by if he's writing to us personally. And you can open the book to a random page and read something that is speaking to you perhaps in that day. Practice deliberately carrying wholesome affirmations into the subconscious, either at bedtime or sitting upright in meditation. Repeat your affirmation out loud to begin with to generate energy and command the attentions of your conscious thoughts. Didn't we just do that? I mean, did we not just do that? You see? Amazing. Okay. And the next in time, the book that he wrote was Your Sun Sign as a Spiritual Guide. He said he had read that to fully understand yoga, you had to have a complete understanding of astrology also. And he said as he read astrological books, he found astrologers were not overly burdened with spiritual insight, as he put it. So he began and there was such a temptation which he found repulsive to categorize people. You're Leo, therefore you're egotistical and always want to be the center of the show. And you'll often find, it's just so unfair. He said the Leos I know are shrinking violets. They hide. They try to stay out of the public eye. But there is a certain a connection between them. So he found people he knew the sun signs of, friends of his. He would meditate on them and see what qualities they shared, what qualities they had together. And so And also it just came from his own insight into people and into, God and so on. He was gratified to hear that a famous astrologer in Hollywood said that this was the best book he'd ever read on the subject. And so it's a very intriguing book and not at all like other books on astrology. It shows us also what we can learn from all of the signs, not just from our own. So then we come now to the new path. And Subhaya was just in fact asking me, you said there was one other book besides Autobiography of a Yogi that we should read, what we should read after that? And so I said, yes, it's the new path. It was originally The Path. And he wrote it in 1976, 1977 he finished it. It was 2 years that it took him to write the book. Very rarely did he spend that much time on any work. The Art and Science of Raja Yoga was one, the New Path was another, and there's a third. There was only 3 that he poured that much energy into. And it wasn't, he poured full amounts of energy into all of them, but in terms of just having to really make it a big piece of his life. So this book also, in a bigger context, came out right at the time of the forest fire. The fire at Ananda village and so on. In fact, the fire was sweeping up the hill towards the publication building where the path was being printed. And so, it was like close to just taking the book with it. And they were able to stop the fire before it burned up the publications building. But still, all the homes, so many acres, the damage that was done. Swamiji was in Hawaii at the time of the fire, and he was editing this book. This was in June of 1976. And he suddenly felt that something very disturbed, something was wrong, he could feel. And then he got a phone call, Ananda Village is on fire, and he took the next flight back to be there. And then spent about just a week there, helping people get, courage and so on, and organized. And people were very courageous and valiant in coming forward. Many left also. And as you know, the first money that came in, Swamiji and the others gave to the people who were leaving, saying, your house was lost here, at least we can compensate you in that way. There was no insurance, etc., etc. But then he went back to Hawaii to continue with the workflow. And you might think, well, shouldn't he have just been there helping out and so on? But he knew this work needed to be done. He said, the work I'm doing will help Ananda more than anything else right now. Getting this book out. How many people came to Ananda at that time, especially from reading this book, and never heard of Autobiography of a Yogi. So there's a whole generation, and even now we find people come and they're just like, I learned of Yoganandaji through Swamiji, through this book. And so the other thing, though, as disciples or readers of Autobiography of a Yogi, is that this book helps you to understand what it was like to live with Master. This is one of the central books for disciples on this path. I know what it's like to read Master's book, but what would it be like to have lived with him? How did he train people? How is he training me? And so Swamiji shares that in his book. In fact, it even says in the preface how a woman recently, having read the book, said, now I feel like I lived with Yoganandaji from having read this book. And so, again, if you haven't read it or read it recently, do read it again. Education for Life was the next book. We're now getting into the early 80s and 1980s. And there was already a school in existence at Ananda, which had been going for several years. And Swamiji took Master's thoughts on education, childhood education, and expressed them into written form, into a coherent philosophy. Not that Master's wasn't coherent, but he didn't present it, in one place. He had written and spoken in different ways. Remember, child education was very important to Master. His first work was this boys' school at Dihika, and then later it moved to Ranchi. And Mount Washington, his headquarters, was originally chartered as a school for girls. But he saw that the parents, there's no way they would send their kids there unless they were converted to the philosophy first. So he necessarily had to begin working with adults. And so then that's how it evolved. But he also showed his vision and intention in that way. Swamiji also reached a crossroads at Education for Life because his own publishing company at that time, when he said, I want to get out a new book, said, we can't. We've spent too much money getting out the previous books, so we just can't afford to get out a new book. And so after understanding the reasons for it, that were given, he said, but I don't agree. You don't have to make the books so beautiful and elaborate. We don't have to spend so much on marketing. You can go out to the stores and give them to people yourself, and the books will sell themselves. Let's just get them out. And the person in charge just said, looked at him as if he were being horribly naive, Swamiji writes. So he started a second publishing company called Crystal Clarity Publications. And he said, all the books I published till now, Ananda Publications has, but from now on I'm working with Crystal Clarity Publications. He said, my first book, I just made not even photocopies, but mimeographs. You remember those mimeograph machines with the purple ink? And you may not have ever turned the wheel yourself, but you've gotten them. If you got them too soon, they were still wet and just had that purple ink on them. And so he said, my first book I published myself with that. We can do it. That book brought, Jyotish and others to Ananda and so on. So this was also Swamiji's way. When he was moving in a direction and the direction was blocked, he would just duplicate the whole thing. So suddenly we had 2 publications. We had all kinds of situations where suddenly there were 2 heads of the department, or there were 2 this and that, because he would never, fire someone. And it wasn't a strategy to force the person out either. He would just throw energy, resources, and people at a blocked situation until it unraveled itself. And he gave people an opportunity to work it out in themselves. And it was really wonderful and continues to be. I'm sure he's still doing that. But also keep it in mind in your own dealings with people, that rather than just say, no, I'm in charge, we're going this way. You like it or don't like it. Be with us or don't be with us. That's it. I know. He never said that. He could have easily said, look, raise your hand if you're Master's direct disciple. He never did that. He said it would be so unfair to people, just pulling the rug out from under them. And it wouldn't have it would not have encouraged that generous attitude also in others. So we should remember that and follow his example. Then he wrote 2 books, he said, partly for the purposes of addressing popular issues. Master wrote on many worldly topics, showing people how to be better businessmen, for example. And so this Art of Supportive Leadership and Money Magnetism were books he wrote to address these needs. He said he also wrote them because he knew they would be popular on popular subjects. They would be popular and they would sell well, and that would give him money for more philosophical books, or rather the publications company for more philosophical books that wouldn't necessarily have a big sale at first, but would be more important in the long run. And in fact, this book, The Art of Supportive Leadership, has been used by the U.S. Army, used in the many schools of business. After Swamiji once gave a breakfast talk to a number of executives in California, one of them jumped up excitedly at the end of the talk and said, because he didn't mention this book, he said, I've just realized who this is. Do you know this book, Art of Supportive Leadership? He said, my job is reviving dying companies and trying to save them. And he said, this is the book I recommend to everybody. And so I'm so honored to meet its author finally, and so on. So very, very helpful and important books. The next book is not this book, but it was the principal essay that's the title of this book, Religion in the New Age. And he wrote it specifically to addressing the yugas and Dwapara Yuga and what life looks like in Dwapara Yuga. This was also an answer to increasing challenges of SRF that were basically saying you're doing it in the wrong way. And he was explaining how all of Master's teachings were connected to a new yuga, a new flexible way of thinking, not just going back to the old caves and blind obedience and all these things. This book came out probably in 2009. 2010 maybe, and it had this essay, which was normally used to be just a pamphlet, but a whole collection of other essays that he wrote just for this book. So it wasn't that he pulled together a bunch of them. He just started having ideas for short essays that he could include in it. This is one of the books that he wrote in India. So there's always a special something for those books as part of our own, India's part of that legacy. And so He even has one in here called a non-essay, where he started writing and realized he'd come to sort of a mutually contradictory point or something and just had to leave the whole thing. But left it there as an example of how you have to be honest in your writing when you've gone down a certain line and then suddenly reached a dead end. Very instructive, because how else would we ever know in developing our own thinking and so on. He also said interestingly once to me of this book, this is the only book where I have actually put in some of my own thoughts, my own reflections on life. And so you might recommend it to people who are interested in that way, that this is the only book I would really call as mine. And at first I was very touched. I was always touched, but I was thinking, wow, it's really Swamiji put himself into this book. And then I thought, one book, which means the 148 other books that he's written, he didn't consider as his own. He didn't put his own thoughts. He just put Master's thoughts, just expressing Master's words. I mean, think about what it takes to be so in tune and so desirous and interested in what someone else thinks, not in what I have to at least put my own spin on it, that you could do that. And yet he knew, as he says in The New Path, that my life is only significant because it touched his. And so what else? That's the greatest treasure I have to share. I have nothing of myself to share. And so I'm sure he felt Master's blessing in writing these too. But he did offer some of his own thoughts this way. So anyway, it's a very, very wonderful book. The title of the book of the talk was Religion in the New Age. Yeah, Swamiji's talk here in Chennai. Good point. Then he wrote the Secrets books. I don't remember how many there are. They're probably like 25 or something. He had originally done them as inspirational thoughts for each day of the month that he was just printing on a piece of paper that you could put on the refrigerator. Then he thought these could be taken and laid out very nicely with different images and pictures, and have a thought in a little book like this that you could hold open and have for that day. A little bit like we do in the Spirit of Living Wisely, Living Well, but on specific subjects: meditation, peace on earth, secrets of friendship, and so on. And so the first one was Secrets of Happiness. And he wrote these. He said he wrote some of them just in a half an hour. He would just dash them off, but each one would be full of inspiration, and it wouldn't be a collection of things he'd already said. He would just put his mind on it and creatively pour it out. He said he once wrote 3 sitting by the pool at the Biltmore Hotel, just waiting for some friends to arrive. And so, in fact, one of his publicists said, "Don't tell people you wrote them in such a short amount of time." But he said, but it was gratifying in a way to be able to just express creatively and so on. He would edit them later to make sure the rhythm and so on, as I mentioned. These books were very popular and continue to be because, first of all, they're small. So a small, 31 pages, okay, I can do that. Look at how beautifully it is. Listening intently. The secret of meditation is listening intently to any sounds you hear in the inner ear, becoming absorbed in them. And so you can spend the whole day just kind of trying to tune into that. And so they're very helpful for devotees, but people generally found them. And this was one thing that really helped Crystal Clarity financially in publishing other books, because these books were so popular. The next book he wrote was Do It Well, which is not the title of this book, but it is the predecessor of this book. And this was, after writing the Secrets books, he thought it would be nice to write a general book for every day of the year. And he called it Do It Now. Sorry, Do It Now, not Do It Well. It was Do It Now, then Do It Well, and then Living Wisely, Living Well. He wrote the whole book in one day. And he said he had to, he realized, because going forward, if he tried to break it up over time, he would begin to forget what he had already said in January, in February, in March. So he wanted to make sure that he didn't repeat the thoughts and so on. Editing the book took longer, he said, but that initial thing, he wrote the whole in one day, 24-hour period. It was just amazing what he was able to do with concentration. And he would say things like this: I wrote the whole book in a day. And as Dharmini mentioned last time, people would say, listen to how he's bragging. And Swamiji sometimes would spell it out for you. The reason I'm telling you this is because you too can do these things. This is the fruit of meditation. This is the fruit of attunement. It may not express itself in writing. It may express itself in cooking and singing and building and many things, in your own natural talent, in your own ways. But again, he wasn't expressing what he had to say. He was saying, Master, come through me. And he would often say, Master, I can't do it, you do it. And then he found he could do it. It would just be done through him. He rewrote this book, again in India, in Pune in 2010, editing it so many times to get the words to be so beautiful. He said it's a collection of 365 short essays. Because in a normal writing of a book, you're always going in a flow. And this, you had to make each thought stand on its own from beginning to end and be engaging right away. And so he said it was very difficult. At the end of it, he was saying to Dharmini, actually, who was there, can you read it and tell me if it's any good? Because I've just lost all perspective. He said, on one level, something, just having gone over it so many times, am I over-editing it? But he said, but I tend never to over-edit, which is true. He would never go beyond. Sometimes you can edit something so much that it just kind of becomes stilted, or it becomes too sort of gilded, and you lose the inspiration. That's the danger of editing, is that initial inspiration is lost. He never did that. And so anyway, he went on, I don't know how many times, maybe 25 times, until we all said, Swamiji, it reads like scripture. And that's one of the reasons why. In fact, he encouraged us all to read this book every day at sadhana, so that's why we do. The next book, Self-Expansion Through Marriage, was about the principal purpose of marriage as being able to learn to relate to another person's reality and to be giving and to expand the ego beyond oneself. He didn't say, therefore, everyone should get married. But he did say that is the spiritual purpose of marriage. And it's very helpful if you are married for you to read. It may be tempting to say it's very helpful for you to give to your spouse to read. But no, it's for you to read. And actually, I first read this book when I was single. And I found it very helpful for just any relationship with anyone. Because obviously, we're in relationship with people all the time. And so very helpful in terms of thinking of the other person's needs and so on, and putting them above your own, while also not saying, well, I'm always putting your needs above my own. No, it's fine, it's fine. Not being a martyr about it and so on. So very, very important book, but an interesting story about it. He had had open heart surgery and was in the recovery room, and they said, listen, this book is at the printers, and we need you to finish editing the preface so it can be printed. And I don't know why it had to be printed that day, but the printers were waiting, like the book was set, and so he said he pushed aside mentally the fog of the anesthesia. I mean, this, if you've ever seen anyone after a major surgery, I mean, if you've ever been one in yourself, I mean, that's it. But he said he just used willpower and pushed it aside and dictated this introduction, or preface. And this went on. The doctor said 1 year complete rest, and it was the most intense year, 1995, of his life. This is also now during the time of SRF's lawsuits against Ananda, saying, we have a copyright to Yogananda's picture and name, and you can't use it publicly. So this was part of what was going on at that time, and it really heated up in 1995. And so the year that he was supposed to get the most rest, he was going to depositions with attorneys and all kinds of things that were going on, and trying to respond to all of this negative energy coming at Ananda by putting out positive and creative energy. He said it's the most productive, creative year of my life in a way, though several other years were like that too. But in the face of such animosity, and physically, his heart, just struggling with his heart. And in fact, the doctor said to him, the reason why you have to rest is because if you go into atrial fibrillation, which is when your heart starts missing beats and doing things, they said you'll never get out of it. Your heart is in such a condition that it'll be in it permanently, which he said is like living inside of a washing machine, and he couldn't do anything when his heart was in that state. And so he was thinking, was he going to leave the body and so on. And it was a concern. They said you have to have the open heart surgery, otherwise you might easily die in your sleep because your blood pressure is dropping so low. So of course, I mean, you can imagine, I mean, this was 1995. So this was 18 years before he actually left the body, and this is how close he was to leaving it then. So a very dramatic life he had, and the story continues. But Awaken to Superconsciousness, this book was amazing because it was called, a famous book company had hired him to write Meditation for Starters. And he said, I can write that book with one hand tied behind my back, so to speak, after decades of teaching meditation and meditating. Then they said, no, we want it to be called Superconsciousness. And he said, well, you can't just slap a new title on the same book. I mean, to write on superconsciousness, think about what that would mean, to actually cover the subject. And furthermore, he had only 2 months to write it in. And it's a very dramatic story. I can't go into it all, but it's very thrilling. How he just wrote this book in 2 months. He didn't take any calls. He didn't answer any emails. He didn't do anything. He said by the end of trying to get it off to the printers or to the publisher, he said even his eyes were sort of filming over because he had been working, so he was splashing water in them, trying to clear them up so he could see, so he could continue to finish. This is basically, I don't want to say a condensed version of Raja Yoga, but it's another treatment of the science of Raja Yoga and covers all of the same subjects, but in a different way. But also from the approach of our desire for God, the need to magnetize God as opposed to just focusing on meditation. Of course, it's all about meditation too, but it's a whole other part of the path that we need to develop in parallel with meditation. And in fact, for years he gave classes on superconscious living, and it's something that we've kind of fallen away from and we really need to revive because it's basically another ingredient on the path that's treated in this book. I'm seeing myself running out of time, so I'm going to be a little more condensed in this. Affirmations for Self-Healing, you all know and love. And this book, he wrote 4 Sunday satsangs. So that's one of the reasons why we use it. But of course, it's generally helpful anyway, for any purpose. Okay. This book, The Essence of Self-Realization, is really what started the whole lawsuit with SRF, because he published this book, he used the name Self-Realization. He said these are master's teachings, and they said only we have the right to use Self-Realization. It's a copyright name that we made up, if you can imagine. Has anybody ever heard of Self-Realization before? So anyway, they finally lost the lawsuit on that basis, that there's no way they made up Self-Realization. But anyway, that was 10 years later, 12 years later. And so this book was the genesis of it all. And after Autobiography of a Yogi and The New Path, this is one of the most important books to read for disciples of this path. What did Master say? Doesn't that seem relevant? So he said this continues to be one of the best-selling and most widely translated books. He took all of the sayings of Master that he had collected over the years and organized them, those that he could, into specific subjects: karma, topics, karma, reincarnation, meditation, getting along with others, and so on. And so he made chapters and themes. And so that's what this book was. And then he told us, I have about as many more sayings. 1/3 of Master's sayings are in The New Path. 1/3 of them that he recorded are in this book. And 1/3 of them are in another book, which I'm getting to. But at the time, there were only the 2/3 that we had. And he said, I have about another 1/3 left. But he just said, no, this book has to come out, do what it has to do, and then in time I'll feel the inspiration to share the rest of them. And you all just go on buy Conversations of Yogananda off the shelf, like, yeah, I'll take this one. Just like, just to understand the evolution of how it all came about. That book is very special for India, too, I'll mention. The last thing I wanted to say about this that way is that, I forgot what I was going to say. Well, if I remember, I'll say it. So, Rays of the One Light, he wrote specifically for Sunday satsangs. It is the child of another book, Rays of the Same Light, which was 3 volumes, And it's all because Master in his Sunday satsangs gave a parallel commentary on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita. But ministers were finding it difficult to draw these comparisons themselves. And so Swamiji wanted to continue that pattern, but he had to write the book so that they could then read the readings, but they were very long. And so it was making the services long. And so there was a need for a shorter book for this. And then he said the need for a longer book, because he wrote those to be short so they could be read on Sunday service. So then he wrote a longer one. The Promise of Immortality Part 1 is the first half of the year. And he never wrote Part 2. Everybody kept asking him every year, so when are you going to write Part 2? I mean, it became the standard question, partly because it's like, ask Swamiji a question. Well, there's a Part 1. Is there going to be a Part 2? Pretty obvious to just, I have a question. And so, I mean, he would say, yes, I know I need to get to it, and so on. But he also said he found the book, I don't know why he didn't write it. He loved the book and he loved this pattern, but he just didn't get around to doing it. So it's the only open hole, in a way you could say. Autobiography of a Yogi. You might say, did Swamiji write this too? No, he didn't write this. But this came out at this time, meaning in 1996. It came out because as a result, at one point, SRF was saying, you can't even quote from Autobiography of a Yogi because we own the copyright to it. So you can't mention it, you can't include any sentence without our permission. And Swamiji said, and you could imagine how eager they would be to give that permission. And then the attorney had an inspiration. He just said, maybe they don't hold the copyright to the book. Which, I mean, again, if you can imagine, especially even in any bookshop here, and seeing all the orange, autobiographies of yogis and so on. And he found that the first edition, Master had taken out a copyright in his own name, and the copyright had not been renewed. And so it had expired, and so the book entered the public domain. Later editions of the book, they had copyrighted as individuals, starting from like the 5th edition or 7th edition, and from then on, that was their version. But the original edition, as Master first published it, was open. And so it was with great joy for two reasons. One is to be able to publish Autobiography of a Yogi and present it. Again, the purpose was not to say, Ananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. It's not that. This is the first edition. It's a reprint of exactly how the first book appeared. The fonts, the illustrations, the words. Some of these were taken out later. Some of the poem Samadhi was words, lines of it were deleted and so on, and all kinds of things in later editions. That was the other reason for joyfully being able to present it without the editorial changes that were made later, which I won't go into. That's the subject of probably 2 more satsangs. Meditation for Starters, he had a chance to write. He said, since it's a great title and a great topic, and since they didn't want the book, I'll write it myself. Remember, this is the one that turned into super consciousness. The Hindu way of awakening is thrilling because he gave basically an interpretation of the symbols of Hinduism according to Master's teachings. So equally valuable for Westerners who are kind of looking at Kali and going, I'm really trying, but I'm kind of getting confused by the image. What does it all mean? And then at the same time, for Indians who, just being born in India and growing up with it, I mean, I can tell you, growing up in America doesn't mean I actually knew anything. And so similarly, growing up, and it doesn't mean we actually know. We know what we've been told, we know that what we've understood, but we don't always know it from a mystical perspective. We don't always know what the saints and yogis would say about these things. Now we do. This book, in a way, provides the sequel to Out of the Labyrinth, the very first book I held up. Because he said to really develop our system of Western philosophy, we have to step outside of it to understand it and what it's lacking. And he said the philosophy of Sanatana Dharma provides us the perfect completion to what's missing in Western philosophy. So really that book leads you to this book. And there's another book which I don't have here called Hope for a Better World, where that completes this trilogy of philosophical books. So if you have philosophical friends who are just out of college or remember all of their reading, and yes, Immanuel Kant, it's like, have you ever read a book by Immanuel Kant? I mean, they're this big. It's because he tried to say everything that could possibly be said about the subject, so no one could come in and build on it, and he could be the last word. Swamiji said, my approach has been just the opposite. I've given seed thoughts for people to take and expand and develop themselves. So anyway, but if you need an answer to Immanuel Kant or anyone else, you read these 3 books of philosophy by Swamiji. You'll be armed to the teeth to answer any challenge, calmly but clearly. So, Conversations with Yogananda I already mentioned. These were the remaining sayings of Master that he had. Some of you know of the book The Master Said, put out by YSS, or Sayings of Yogananda. Swamiji contributed, I think, 40% or 60%, about half of those sayings are in that book, that are in that book are from Swamiji's notes, interestingly. This book came out, it was his first book in India. It was published in India. It was a whole television series that went on for 365 days, from each one a conversation from this book. Those episodes are being re-released online in high def HD, so you can see them now as they appeared. And it really launched Ananda's work in India, because we would walk through the mall with Swamiji, and people from all, on all levels of the mall would just stop and they would look. And they would even point. And it wasn't just because there was someone, a Western person in Gheru, walking. Is they would wave also. And people would come up to him and said, "Sir, I've seen you on television. Sir, I watch your TV show every night." So even my cousin said, "Yeah, I saw your Swamiji on TV." Just like, for my cousin to say that, it is spread far and wide and so on. And so, it really, so many people came to Ananda in the early days of Ananda India through having seen Swamiji on TV. And it was just thrilling. But again, very thrilling. Another Autobiography of a Yogi, New Path, Essence of Self-Realization, Conversations with Yogananda. Sadhu Beware, he wrote when he arrived in India to help a monastic order get started. And then this book, in a way, really led into the Nayaswami order. But at the time, it was still just giving the emphasis to the monastics. And I would love to say more. Save it for another satsang. This book, this is actually 26 lessons. This is Material Success Through Yoga Principles. And this is the first time it's been published in this format. So you are the first ones, really, to see it looking like books. It was always 26 lessons, just like Raja Yoga had been, 14. So this was 26, one for every other week of the year. He said, because these things take time to digest. And it is basically, many of you have heard the story, but a doctor, when Swamiji had double pneumonia, which, just in case you don't know, means both lungs are filled with fluid. And I thought Swamiji at one point was going to have triple pneumonia, because he was just suffering so much. He would take on people's karma, he would burn up their karma, and he would also take on the karma of getting this work started. Anyway, it's quite intense. But a doctor came in when he was lying in the recovery room and said, "Sir, can you help me?" And Swamiji said, doctors normally say, can I help you? And he said, I have a son in college in Canada, and I believe in yoga philosophy. But how can I really be materially successful without cutting a few corners and fudging Dharma a little bit? And Swamiji said, I have found that by holding rigidly to Dharma, I have been more successful. The man, he said, looked very skeptical and walked out. And Swami said, there I was lying with double pneumonia. I wasn't exactly an advertisement for success at that moment. But then he said, India needs this. And he wrote this specifically for India. Understanding how to take Sanatana Dharma and translate it into material success with integrity, with honesty, but with so many examples from his own life. The story of the fire and so on, where he didn't sue the county even though he could have, and on and on and on and on. How you hold to Dharma and you always win, even though Divine Mother likes to make it look like you never will. And anyway, another satsang or two. But this is the other book that he spent 1.5 years writing. And he said, I worked so hard. Plus, this book, when he wrote it, all of us said, we've never heard you say these things before. You might think, Art of Supportive Leadership and Money Magnetism and all of his talks, he probably just wrote it down finally in this book in printed form. No, he had never said these things. Devi said, we never knew you were thinking this when you were developing Ananda. You never wrote these thoughts down. And he said, I've never had these thoughts before. He said, Master is writing it through me. And as he's saying, I'm saying, wow, that's a good idea, and writing it down. Others, of course, were ones he had developed and had tested, but hadn't always said, this is my management style, this is how my vision that I'm developing. But he did finally in writing this course. Okay, so now we are in the books that came out in India. As I said, beginning with Conversations with Yogananda, then Sadhu Beware was just a small thing. Not a small book, but I mean, he wrote it very quickly, principally for the monastics, I think. And then this Material Success Through Yoga Principles was a whole stretch, finally coming out in 2005. And then he came to what he said is the most important book he's written, which is The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. And though I've been telling you Autobiography of a Yogi, New Path, Essence of Civilization, Conversations with Yogananda, and then people always remind me, and the biography, right? And I say, oh yeah, that's right. Because we didn't grow up with the biography. It came out only recently, and so we don't always think, which we should, think of it that way. The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. He wrote this book in less than 2 months. 600 pages. He said it's not possible. But Master did it through him. And it's a thrilling story. He had edited Master's original manuscript. And in fact, during the lawsuit, SRF was forced to turn over copies for him to look at, practically at gunpoint, don't you touch it. Copies of the Master's original manuscript with Swamiji's handwriting in the margins and so on, different things. Master had asked him to edit it. Not obviously to edit the philosophy, but to work with the flow of words and so on. And he said, I predict you'll make a good editor someday. This is all told in the New Path, so you should read it again. But he was meditating, saying, Master, you've got to put this book out. The version that they put out is just, he said, it's lost all the inspiration, none of the joy, all the funny stories they deleted. They added all of this philosophy and explanation and footnotes from other people justifying why what Master said is true. He said, Master said it, isn't that enough? Why do we need to also say, and this has been corroborated by X, Y, and Z? I mean, the reader will make up his own mind, sure. But we don't need evidence to support the Guru's claims, other than what he's given himself. But also, and he said there's even points of philosophy that are wrong in it. But anyway, he said, how can I, in a dream to Master, he said, how can I get my hands on that manuscript? He said, without bringing in a SWAT team or something, which is like the armed division of the police and so on. And so Master said, don't overlook the possibility of a skylight. A skylight is a window in the ceiling that you might never have in Chennai, but in somewhat cooler places it's useful. It's kind of nice to have that coming in. And so you could have the skylight in December, but then cover it up for April. So then he suddenly found, as he started writing the book, that every sloka, everything Master said, concept for concept, just returned to his mind. And he just wrote it down. He wrote at least 10 pages a day, for all those. It was just amazing and a miracle. And he was so thrilled when this book came out. So again, if you ask him, which we did once, what is your most important book? And we expected the New Path, of course, or something. And he said, The Essence of the Bhagavad Gita. Why? Because Master said, millions will find God through this book. Not just thousands, millions. I know, I have seen it. When he finished dictating the last part of it, he said, a new scripture is born. People will read the Gita like they've never read the Gita before. He said, I tuned into Veda Vyasa's consciousness, asked him to write through me, and so on. And as I said, that presentation of the book, you don't really get all of that from. Or at least I haven't. Anyway. But you can get it, certainly, from here. And it's just thrilling. So this was sort of the crown jewel, you might say, of India. And he wrote it in India, too. And then this book is just the slokas of the Gita. But there's still something in it. It's not just, okay, he excerpted this. He put a commentary in of the first chapter where you understand what each warrior's name means. It represents a psychological trait. He said this was the most exciting part of the Gita, but the hardest part He didn't even put it in the big book, because he said if I did, then chapter 1 of the Gita would be half the book. And in fact, that's how it is in YSS's version. You're like, it was practically the first, it's a 2-volume set. The first volume is like chapter 1. And it's not completely, but it's mostly, and then it goes on. And so he said, we've just got to get to the Gita. But he said, but on the other hand, this was the most exciting part, that this warrior wasn't just a name. It meant this part of yourself that's in conflict, the good side and the bad side. And so it's very informative. So he said he put all of that in the footnotes of this book so as to be able to present it. So you should read both. Revelations of Christ. Does anyone remember the movie, The Da Vinci Code?
Yeah.
And then, or the book? And then it had a sequel, Angels and Demons and so on. So Swamiji wrote this book in answer to that movie. He said the man is a complete fraud. He said because he is writing the story as if it has been thoroughly researched, as if he has, gone and done all of this work and then put together a case for what the ridiculous things he says about Jesus Christ. And then whenever someone challenges him, he says, it's only fiction. And he said, it's blasphemy what he's done. And he said, why? Why care? Because so many people's faith were shaken by that movie. They thought, my gosh, maybe it was so. Maybe he was just a man. And then if anybody said, you're shaking people's faith, well, it's just a story. And so he said, no. He said, either stand up for your lies and say, I am lying, or say, no, I believe this, or don't write it. But don't write it and then say, I didn't write. He said, it's ridiculous. So he wrote this book, and he dedicated it to Christians whose faith has been shaken. It's also a beautiful book for understanding Christianity from the point of view of Sanatana Dharma. The first half of the book basically develops the philosophy of Sanatana Dharma as it's expressed through Christianity. And then the second half is once you know, Kundalini, the spine, and all these things, how do you see that reflected in the Bible? So it's really quite a wonderful book if you're familiar with Christianity or not. Yes, so Master wrote a commentary on the Bible called The Second Coming of Christ, and also commented on that. This is inspired by that, but isn't in the same way Master's Second Coming of Christ, just as presented by Swamiji. And so the truths are definitely Master's, and it's Master's teaching entirely. But it isn't meant to follow his commentary, whereas the Bhagavad Gita commentary did follow Master's commentary exactly. Whispers from Eternity, written by Master, as it turned out, also entered the public domain. And Swamiji found Master's book of poems, different things he could do, and he felt Master's blessing on it, to make the poems flow just a little more beautifully and so on. And one woman wrote to him, a longtime disciple, saying, how dare you edit Master's book? And then he basically said, well, I'm sorry if you don't like even the idea of me doing so. You don't have to read it. But he also just kept on. He said, I feel his inspiration to do so. I feel his blessing. When she read it, finally, she said, my gosh. She said, you haven't changed it at all, except in the flow and the beauty and the rhythm and so on and things. And it feels just like the same book, only even more brighter and beautiful. And I think she regretted just her, knee-jerk reaction against it. In Divine Friendship, a beautiful way to get to know Swamiji. It's a book of letters that he wrote. In fact, he wrote all the letters, but someone else compiled them all into a book, and he just went through it briefly, looking it over. But it's not like he edited it more. He had already written it over the years. Letters from 1970 all the way to 2000 whatever. So a beautiful thing to understand the way Swamiji wrote in two ways. One, so that you can have answers to your own questions as if you had written a letter, but also so you can see how he chose to answer people, critics or sincere questioners and so on, what he expressed, so you can understand how you could express or reply to people in the same way. It's really quite a wonderful insight into his I don't want to say his personality, but to the way that God flowed through him. Then now we come, we're almost at the end, the Renunciate Order for the New Age. This is the Nayaswami book before it was called Nayaswami. We just knew it was a renunciate order for the New Age. We didn't even know what he was going to call Swamis or Nayaswamis or anything. And only on the chapter where he finally wrote it did we finally get, okay, that's what it was. This caused such a confusion within Ananda. Because, and that's the other thing you're not getting, is how each book sort of shook up the community. Rarely in alarm, but just sort of, this is our new direction. The Gita, okay, this is our new direction. The Bible, this is all, there are others that were specifically for. Education for Life started a whole conference and series of conferences on Education for Life, bringing people here. He was always so enthusiastic about every book. We should all get behind this. That's just the way he was. And we all did. But it's the way you can do it too. When reading, just immerse yourself in that book and think about how it applies to your life and how you can share it with others. But this book, we were saying, we already have a monastic order. We have what's called the Sevaka order, which is for Ananda members, once they become Kriya Bonds, live in a community for 7 years or more, living inside a community, then entering what you would say is a monastic order dedicated to Ananda, related to the organization or the spiritual family that is specifically Ananda. This book, it was sort of like, do we need a new renunciate order? We just couldn't understand it. We were in this, some people could, I'm sure, but I couldn't. Just like, does the old one not count? Or what are we saying? Then we realized, first of all, this was formal renunciation, where you change your clothing, you change some of your outer habits, and so on. Before, Nayaswami Jaya was just Jaya. He wasn't even Jaya Ji, he was just Jaya. And when we had this in America, people were like, now what does this mean? And then one of my Indian friends in Bangalore said, I'm so glad you have this, because you see Jaya and you know what he is. But there's no way to introduce that to a new person. They just see, oh, there's this guy. But when you can call him as Nayaswami Jaya, people will instantly understand the context from which he'd come. Now, you can say a title doesn't mean anything, and that's absolutely true. But still, you can sometimes miss a saint. It isn't that you should take pronunciation so people know who you are. My God, if you do, then don't take it. Forget it. It's not for that at all. But just to say that it put especially Ananda's work in a context that especially India could relate to. But also, this order is open to people from all paths. Unlike Ananda's order, anybody can join. Just like in Shankara's order, it's open to, it's not related to your guru only. In fact, some people have a different sannyas guru from their meditation guru and so on. And so, similarly, it included married people anyway. The Nayaswami order is a whole beautiful other topic. And remember, many of you have taken the pilgrim vow, which is the entry vow into the order. And if you haven't taken it and would like to, then come talk to us, because it's a very powerful step. Okay, this is all. That was in India especially. The Time Tunnel, he was editing in India. I forget where he began writing it. He picked up The Wizard of Oz, as he said, in an idle moment, and then thought, he hadn't even gotten past the Yellow Brick Road, which is the very beginning of the book, when he thought, maybe I could write a children's novel. And so he started writing this book. And I wanted to share with you a letter he wrote as in the process of editing it, only because we would get these all the time. And so it's a part of understanding the process of what Swamiji went through. And I think it's invaluable to know a little bit of the history and the tradition, not tradition in terms of patterns, but tradition in terms of a shared common history and understanding that context. Because it does have to stay alive in that way as it is useful to people. And is most of all useful to you. But he wrote this. Asha, who had agreed to write the preface for this book, wrote me recently that she'd read the first 5 chapters and they sparkled. I thought, well, let's see. As I went over the manuscript, I saw that much more work was needed to really make it shine. Now I've made many hundreds more changes, and I like every word. Really, I think this book could win a prize, and I'd like to suggest that we try for one or more. In other words, I'm pleased with it. In fact, I'm blissful. I don't think anything quite like it has ever been done before. I hope you'll endorse my enthusiasm for it. At any rate, I've given it my very best shot. Love, Swami. And so this would just happen over and over again. New version of the book. This is the final version. This is the final version. This is the triple vinyl. This is the last version, I hope. He was always refining them. And then you get them in their final version, and then it's so thrilling. But to see, again, the process that went into that. It was never about clarifying what he meant to say, ever. That was always there from the beginning. He wasn't going, okay, I finally figured it out. It was that he was trying to make it, as he said, shine and flow that way. The last 3 books, Paramhansa Yogananda, a biography. There's a whole other interesting story to this too, and that it came out of a movie script that he had written about Master's life. But that's a different story. But much of that work came into this, but then he realized no one has written a biography of Master. Presumably because he wrote an autobiography. But if you think about it, so little of that book is actually about him. It's about people he met, experiences he had, but not his own story. And there is the book Majda, which is his brother's stories about him and so on. And they're helpful in a certain context, but his whole life and its impact, he said he was surprised he never thought to write it. And so then it came and it flowed through him all in just 3 weeks. It was just thrilling. And it was a major book launch at the time. Many of the books at the end of his life he just wrote in a very short amount of time. And then they flowed. Patanjali, again, this is a book that people often buy relatively soon. Like, yeah, okay, autobiography, okay, Patanjali. And again, this came out in 2012. So we were all just like, Swami, what about Patanjali? Swami, what about Patanjali? Master gave classes in Patanjali. We want to know about Patanjali. Patanjali wrote a scripture called the Yoga Sutras. As yogis, you would think we would want to know, not he, but we would think we would want to know, what about the Yoga Sutras? Teriyade. I don't know. It's like the Yoga Sutras. You don't know anything about the Yoga Sutras. How can you even be called a yogi? Well, there is this thing called the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna says, be a yogi. But anyway, what about the Yoga Sutras? Plus, the Yoga Sutras have been so widely abused in America because they're so terse and so concise that you can basically say, this means whatever I want it to mean. The object of knowing, which is that which knows the object, which is of the object, but also not of the object. Object. It's just like, well, that means we should all be objects. It's just like you can say anything you want. And so, in fact, yogis, Hatha yogis, let's go to Yoga Sutras. Why? Because that's the scripture. Why don't you like the Gita? Well, because that's too demanding. That concentrates on how you should actually behave. That's also spiritual. That's also God. Yoga Sutras don't directly mention God in that same way. Very convenient. Not for a devotee, not even for a truth seeker, really. But still. So finally, Swamiji had the inspiration to write the book, and it was thrilling what he's done. And again, do go through it if you haven't already. And then finally, the last book. There's a few other books at the end, Pilgrimage to Guadalupe, and a few others that we have to get in stock, but this is the final book. And he wrote it out of an inspiration about soulmates. Master, so he remembers, spoke only once about soulmates. And he wrote a very short article. In fact, we can't even find the article, or somebody could. He said the reason why Master didn't say more on soulmates is he didn't want everybody looking for their soulmate on every street corner. He's just like, ah. And furthermore, on the spiritual path, not so much in India, but especially in America, you find that people, when they enter into a spiritual path, their heart finally opens. That happens in both places. But after opening to God, it then also opens horizontally to sort of the other person whose heart is also open, and instantly people get into a relationship. And Swamiji urged people, when you join, spend at least a year waiting before you get involved in a relationship, so that you can really give yourself to God, so you can also really understand yourself before getting involved in another person and so on. And so this has been a thought which, again, isn't so relevant for India in an outer way, but in an inner way, it's absolutely relevant. Take your first year or even years as I am trying to get to know myself. I am trying to get to know God, even if I'm in a marriage, which of course many of you are. It doesn't mean you're withholding anything, but just to say, as I strengthen myself, my own understanding, I will also strengthen my relationship, my partner, and so on. And if you're not in a marriage too, it's like, well, let me be married to Divine Mother. Let me be married to God as the beloved also. So you see, there's a whole side to that. But the point is that he said, everything in reality has a dual. Hot and cold and so on, because of duality. So isn't it obvious that every soul must have a counterpart also? A twin soul, and Master did say something limited on the subject. And again, I see some eyebrows going up. Oh, did he? Where is that? It's like, yeah, I know, that's how, and it's like, look, let the Guru be your soulmate, and so on, and so. But anyway, still, fine, it's not, he said there's also in everybody an instinctive yearning to find that match. But he also talks about how that is needed. Master said you must unite with your soulmate before merging in God. Even if the soulmate is on another planet, you can do so in vision. And he said it's not an outward kind of union, it's an inner union. But still, Master said that much. So Swamiji was inspired to rewrite a book called, I think, Life Everlasting or something like that is the original title. That is a book written by a woman, Marie Corelli, which apparently was the only book Master actually ever read cover to cover. Master read about 20 books when he was in America and never finished any of them except this book, this original book in its original version. So Master Swami was intrigued. Why this book did Master single out? And so he, when reading it, though he had read it before and loved it, he said, it misses the philosophy by a lot, not by a little. He said it's beautiful, but she wasn't trained in the truths of the Sanatan Dharma and so on. But it's a novel, and it was one of Swamiji's few novels. I think he wrote 3, Time Tunnel, Pilgrimage to Guadalupe, and this one. And so I had read to you, those of you who were here a few weeks ago, an excerpt from it. It's just thrilling. And he also, with every book, and especially this one, he writes some things at the end that we never heard him say, ever. And not, oh, well, we didn't hear him say it in that way. We never heard that thought expressed. You can always trace every thought back to love God. So sure, on that level, yes. But in terms of this particular emphasis, this particular technique, this particular warning, this particular encouragement, they're all completely new. So keep this in mind in terms of your journey and really view it as a personal connection sitting with Swamiji. And especially if you have a mental bent, if you sort of are kind of a reader or a philosopher or so on, then school yourself in these teachings. I was so thrilled when I came to Swamiji that he had written so much, because I had this mind that needed to know and needed to integrate what I thought I had understood with all of Master's teachings, and I couldn't make the connections on my own. And all I had to do was just consume the books, and I just felt it was kind of like in The Matrix, if any of you saw that movie where he wants to learn something, so they stick a little chip into the computer, he goes, and then the guy comes up to him and says, what happened? He said, I know Kung Fu. So this is like spiritual Kung Fu. And it's true, because sometimes when you're on the spiritual path, people come at you. And they go, oh yeah? And you need to be able to answer that, or not to answer it, but to not get shaken by that. That's the thing that happens so much for devotees. Well, I hadn't thought of that, and I don't know what to say, and maybe it is true. And people delight in trying to cut down someone else's faith because it's a challenge to them. Because either you have to be cut down to size or they have to grow up. And so as Master said, Jesus Christ was a mirror to mankind of its own need to grow. So you have 2 choices, grow or break the mirror. And it's true of all of us. If you might find somebody trying to break the mirror. Now don't walk around saying, I'm a mirror. You want to see your potential? Right here. Don't be like that. And there's some people like, just a little, no, don't be like that at all. Why? Because it hurts you. Who cares about even other people? Of course we care, but it's like the damage it does to us is our own ego going, So don't be that way. But don't be surprised if people come at you. Especially in the beginning. Part of it is Divine Mother's way of bringing tests, of bringing strength, and then sometimes later on. It's always a test, but it doesn't mean we have to answer. Answer people who are curious. As Master said, real intellectuals you never have any trouble with. Because they're truthful. They want to know the truth. So you can always discuss, and they're doubting positively, meaning they're asking questions wanting to know the answer. But negative doubt is saying there is no answer. And that's often what you get, is people trying to protect their own philosophy that they've created by saying your philosophy can't exist, and therefore I'm giving you all the reasons why, because I don't want my own faith shaken. And it doesn't mean we should say, oh yeah, well I'm going to shake your faith. No. Just sometimes it's better to leave them be. And remember, again, you've been there. Just where they are. Because if you hadn't, you would. If you hadn't, you would be attracted to it. So if you're not attracted, it's because you've already drunk it to the bottom and gone, pah, and say, Vendam. And so that's why Master said it's the only way to overcome an attraction to anything is to fulfill that desire and then discover it's still not enough. So never sit in judgment of anyone, because you can say, look, I could actually make your case better for you than even you're making it. But I know there's a different way now. But when someone is interested, don't hesitate to share either. That's the other side of it. We keep it precious and we don't really want to tell anyone for fear that they will just trample on our enthusiasm. And on one level, yes, but when there is an opening, do share. Do encourage. I was, that movie, Finding Happiness. At one point, the director was saying, okay, I want you to just walk and talk. He wasn't like that, but he was a little bit like that. But forgive me, Ted, if you ever see this. But anyway, so we were walking. He was saying, just talk. And so we were walking and talking. Oh, that's what it was. We had to, in a certain direction, we had to stick to the script. Then on the other direction, we walked back. For some reason, we could just say anything extemporaneously. And I was having a fun time until I realized that I was on a mic, of course, but that everybody on the set, like everybody, like the guy sweeping and all that, had headphones on and could hear everything I was saying. Like, so what college did you go to? So I went to this, it was really interesting, and so on. And so you think you're talking to someone, and then I walked to get some water, and some friend of mine, but said, my mother went to that same college. I was like, what? How did you? And I just thought, oh my God, everything I'm saying, everybody's hearing. So anyway, but as we were walking back, this is about being ready to share. She said to me, in character, but still, she said, Juliet, the actress, her name is Elizabeth Rome, but she said, are people from outside welcome to visit your communities? And I said, if this is something that we've done that has meant so much to us, why wouldn't we be eager to share it with others? And the director said, say that! Gone the same way, go back, say that again. And so I went, oh, okay, so then we walked back, and then, but I'm just saying, it's just think about that which is so precious to you. Wouldn't you want someone else to experience that same joy? Wouldn't you want them to have that same transformation, that same open-heartedness, and that same thrill? And that's the epitome of what Swamiji has done throughout everything in his life, is to bring this joy to others, and also to bring it to us so that we can bring it to others. So, God bless you.